Back while England investigate their mid-series trip to Noosa, Australia's selectors are focused on an Ashes clean sweep and who to select for the Boxing Day test. With many selection questions that need to be answered over the next 48 hours, helping us understand it all is Code Sports cricket writer Daniel Cherney, who joined Drew Jones at the MCG.
Hello, Daniel. How are you?
Drew, well, yourself?
Yeah, going very well. We're going better than England right now, that's for sure. I want to talk about the stuff with Noosa, but let's talk Australia and selection issues first, because there is so much to unpack here. I think let's start with Nathan Lyon and his replacement. Todd Murphy in the squad is bowling at the moment. Will we see him play his first test on Australian shores?
Look, I couldn't say for sure. My gut feel is probably yes. I think the fact that the MCG pitch, it doesn't tend to break up, but it also doesn't tend to be overly explosive from a pace perspective. And I think we saw last year, albeit it was a hotter test, but it went the distance. And I think they'll be mindful of not trying to stretch the quicks too much. And I think a spinner might just get the nod. But I could also see a world where he doesn't play, where they potentially go in with Bo Webster as sort of a hybrid option, potentially at 7 at the expense of Cam Green, and maybe Jai Richardson plays as the fourth quick. So I'm a little bit concerned about Richardson's durability, as much as obviously he's been very impressive in recent weeks. Clearly he hasn't played that much cricket, so there's a little bit of a concern there. So it's going to be fascinating.
It is interesting, isn't it? So you put it to Andrew and Donald yesterday, the different spin options that they potentially were considering. Kuhnemann amongst that, and Rockacholi has had a great Sheffield Shield season. Swepson's the interesting one because leg spinners do have a better record here at the MCG and tend to spin it a bit more. But the fact that Murphy, plays some of his Shield cricket here at the MCG, and to be honest, it seems like he'd play a similar role for Australia that he does for Victoria, which is the seamers do a lot of the heavy lifting, and he's able to come in and pick his moments. He's suited to these conditions?
I think so. I mean, as Andrew McDonald noted yesterday, Victoria doesn't play that much, or there just isn't that much Shield cricket played at the MCG these days. But Murphy clearly has played enough here. He's had an interesting career arc. I mean, played for Australia very young at 22 on the back of very little first-class cricket, really only sort of a season and a half of being a regular for Victoria, if that. In fact, I think he might have even been picked for Victoria before he was even notionally Victoria's number one spinner, because John Holland was still playing at that point. Impressed early days for Australia, then probably had some shoulder issues. His form had been middling, but he seems to be back to his best. Had a couple of very impressive hauls early in the season, a game against New South Wales at the Junction Oval. Clearly Victoria's seam attack, headed by Scott Boland and Fergus O'Neill, and then with support of the likes of Mitch Perry and Sam Elliott, meant that Murphy rarely has to play the starring role, but he's very good at tying, holding up an end. He's pretty consistent. He's also not a bad handy lower order batting option, which does come into the equation at least a little bit. So I think overall it's a sound selection. I think there was a strong argument for Rockacholi and for Kuhnemann, but I don't think Murphy's a bad decision by any stretch either.
You mentioned Jai Richardson, so I mean, maybe it's because I'm West Australian, but I just get excited seeing his name, in the squad and on the team sheet. He's had to work so hard to get back from that shoulder concern, which was really felt like it was holding him back for a couple of years, didn't it? So we hope that he's back to his absolute best. From all reports, he's bowling quick in the nets, and he's feeling pretty good. So when you weigh up that durability issue with the fact that someone they can bring in who's that explosive at this stage of a test series, what do you think his chances of getting picked up?
I think it's sitting on the fence here. I think it's a 50-50 call. I think the most likely outcome, I think the most likely path for him to play is at the expense of Murphy. And but I think there's also a potential route where he plays as the third quick. But I think, they're weighing up all these options, and probably the idea of him playing as a fourth seam option, which eases a bit of the pressure, and he plays. It's a bit similar to how Pat Cummins might have played in Brisbane, as sort of a fourth quick, given that the big three would have done, the other three would have done the bulk of the bowling. Look, I saw him in Adelaide. I mean, he's bowling behind us now, I think, but I saw him in Adelaide where he was training with the Aussies. And in Adelaide, you're right behind the nets, and almost to the extent where you're sort of jumping every time they bowl because I'll flinch. But he was bowling beautifully, just great speed. Because I know for a while it was a real struggle for him to get back up to his top speed, but obviously I didn't have a speed gun, but he looked pretty close to full throttle there. So it'd be great to see. He's been a great story. He's gone through a lot of adversity. It's hard to believe 4 years. I mean, he was an incumbent in the team before the Boxing Day test 4 years ago, and then missed out. Some injury concerns. Scott Boland got his chance and hasn't looked back. So it would be a nice full circle moment if he comes back and plays this test. Yeah,
he played well in that third test in Adelaide. Pink ball test was it against England 4 years ago. So if Richardson doesn't get the nod and Murphy's in, so who's your third seamer who replaces Pat Cummins for you?
I think Michael Neser ahead of Brendan Doggett. I think, look, Doggett, I wouldn't say did a lot wrong across the first couple of tests, and as Andrew McDonald noted yesterday, he's played in a role that's sort of not completely unfamiliar, but certainly not the role he conventionally plays for South Australia, where he's the new ball bowler, uses his shape and his swing and seam, and he's just a very skillful bowler. He was a bit more of a blunt weapon, I suppose, for Australia.
We haven't seen him use his skills, have we?
No,
really?
he was the short ball option in the absence of Josh Hazlewood and Pat Cummins. They needed someone to play that role, and clearly, given that they're a bit concerned about Cameron Green and him not doing too much of that. So he probably didn't get the best chance to absolutely show what he can do, and he'd be a very good option. But by the same token, if you're weighing up him or Michael Neser, it's pretty hard to go past the guy who took 5 wickets in his last test, and obviously that extra batting too. So I suspect Neser would get the nod ahead of Doggett.
And they've got a decision to make in the middle order, so Steve Smith clearly returns captain's bats 4. Is your expectation that Kawhi just drops to 5 and probably Inglis gets squeezed out?
I would think so. I mean, I can certainly see an argument that Inglis keeps his spot as the younger guy, and they've invested a fair bit into him, but he probably just hasn't quite done enough across his couple of tests. He made a century on debut in Gaul at the start of the year, but it's been somewhat middling since then. I do have a few concerns about him and balls on his stumps. There's a record where it's not great. He does seem to be a bit exposed in that regard. And more to the point, while Khawaja clearly is just about at the end, I think you have to say that he deserves to hold his spot on the back of a very important contribution last week in Adelaide. The test one was won by 82 runs. He made 80 and 40 odd. Did his job. I know he was dropped on 5, but you've got a reward for him. They don't play another test till August. Who knows whether he plays beyond this series, but I think he's done enough to earn his spot and to get the nod ahead of Inglis.
So